Okay, I think we're about ready to start. So I think he's just checking to see that it's going live. When this is done live, it actually is delayed by a minute or two. So there you go. Okay, good evening, everyone. And sorry that we're starting a couple of minutes late. We're still learning the technology, apparently. So I'll just leave it at that. So I'm very excited to be with you again tonight and have another lesson on church history, or a lesson from church history. And tonight we're going to talk about the marriage of church and state. And we're going to spend most of our time just in a few short years rather than a span of hundreds. All right, so let's try that again. There we go. Okay. So first we'll talk about, I'm going to do an edict. That's going to be a word that you'll hear tonight. And so I had to look up what edict was and look at where it came from. It's from the Latin edictum. Thank you, Mark, for sharing, which means a proclamation. So this, instead of announcements, we're doing an edict tonight. All right. So just a reminder about the comments and questions. If you're live, send them to anybody that's here, and Nate Gilmore, Jesse Black. I did put Jesse's cell phone number up there, so you can send that to him. If you're recorded, please email or comment. Email would be the best. I'll respond and try to make sure that we address any questions or concerns as we move through it. You can do it on the YouTube channel or the Church Center app, but I'm not guaranteeing I'm going to get to that real quick. And then my information is over there. And then we also have resources on the Church Center app, and there's a couple I still need to put on there from tonight. So that will get started from the mailbag. All right. And so this is somebody that made a comment, and this was our friend Nate. And last week he said, at what point did official sanctioned teaching institutions for the Christian theology appear? Because we had talked about the different schools and how they were starting to develop. And so I was not able to answer that question last week. I did a little research, and it was, since he's qualified this with official and sanctioned, the answer would be in 1563 when the Council of Trent commissioned the first seminary. Not sure if that answers your question, Nate. It probably doesn't. But we are going to see the first official teaching established tonight. And when I put official in air quotes, if you will, because that is what's going to happen. All right? Jess, so we're going to give me a high sign? We're good? Okay. So tonight, what we're going to cover, just as I run through this real quick, like secular impacts on history, should have been of history on the church. Kind of got that reversed. How did the church change, especially from these secular impacts? Why did it happen? What challenges did they face? And who were some of the influential people? And then lastly, we're going to try to hit what the church was like, because it changed pretty rapidly over a few years. So words of the week, Gus Gnosis over here. And the first word is creed. And a creed is from the Latin word credo, which means I believe. All right, so that's real easy. In English, it came to refer as a statement of shared beliefs by a community, which summarizes the core tenets of that community. And so that's an interesting one. I would have said if it was a creed, it would have been a statement. It's what I would have said. It's not. It's a statement that says, I believe. And we'll see a creed tonight. And then canon is another word that will be used tonight. That is from the Greek word canon, which means a rule or measuring rod. We will talk about the canon of the New Testament, all right? And usually that refers to the 27 books of the New Testament. But it really means a measuring rod that you would measure against. The change referred to set of principles or rules where it denotes a collection of sacred texts, and we just kind of covered that. So that's the two words for tonight. There's a couple of other that I probably should have put on there, but we'll get to those when we get to them. So our timeline tonight, we're going to cover just about 50 years, all right? So we're going to slow down a little, but in this time period, in fact, even compressed in that time period, there's major, major things going to happen. So where we started, or where we left off last week with Diocletian, and Diocletian was a Roman emperor. He ruled for, I think it was 21 years, and as he's getting to the end of his reign, he actually abdicates to the throne and to go raise cabbages, all right? And they even tried to call him back. He said, no, I got my cabbages growing out here in the field. I'm happy with that. So if you retire and start gardening, you got a role example over there. During his time, there was a great persecution. And when he abdicated the throne, this guy, Galerius, is the one that took his place. He was actually, and you'll hear later, he was the son-in-law of Diocletian. We'll talk more about Galerius. All right. Galerius issued the Edict of Serdica. All right, so that's something that you'll have. We talked about what our edict was, and so we mentioned this, that he issues the Edict of Serdica that you probably have never heard of, and we'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about Galerius. And then we have Constantine the Great. And he's going to reign from 306 to 337, and you'll notice there's a gap in there. Galerius is in there, but he overlaps with Galerius, and there actually is another 5 people. There ended up at one point or another during a span of about a year, 6 different emperors. And that was a civil war. And 4 of them were very powerful. A couple of them kind of switched out in there. We're not going to get too much into that, probably not any more into that, but just letting you know that that's what happens in there. Now, Constantine, he starts in 306, and he won the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 313. These dates here are the ones I want you to pay attention to. Milvian Bridge, and we're going to cover those, but that's 313. And then he also issued the Edict of Milan in 313. And you may have heard of the Edict of Milan. Most people will say that's when Christianity became legal. Actually, the Edict of Serdica preempted that. All right. The founding of Constantinople was in 324, and that has a lot of significant impacts on what's going to go on for later on. All right. Down the road. And then the Council of Nicaea was 325. And that's a date that if you talk to anybody that's even got a little bit of familiarity with church history, they will know that date, 325. And it was the Council of Nicaea. And we'll talk about that more. And then Constantine, basically, he was baptized in 337. And that's when he passed away. So we'll not talk too much about that other than his baptism. Speculation on why he waited to the end of his deathbed to be baptized, and part of it was some of the stories will say that he felt he was a sinful man and he wanted to have his sins covered at the end, and he didn't want to, as emperor, he's going to have to do some things that are not maybe Christian, and so he wanted to have all that covered, make sure he had that covered by his baptism, if you will. So he wanted to, it says, well, after this, I'll be perfect after this. And it's kind of like, well, he didn't understand the concept. But his conversion, if you want to talk about when he really has the conversion, we'll talk about the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. Now, Diocletian's transfer of power, this sets up a tetrarchy, is what he tried to do. That means four rulers. And he wanted to set this up, and this little map that's showing there, it shows you the 4 different rulers. And there's yellow, and that was Constantius, and that was Constantine's dad, and he ruled that area of the world. You'll see it's Gaul, Great Britain, some of that area that you'll see up in there, part of Germany today. And then in the green was Maximinus, and he's down here in this Africa and Spain, and so that was his part of the rule. And then the pink, it was Valerius, and Valerius was an emperor that he's actually a brother-in-law to Constantine. And so they kind of would get along. And then out east was Galerius. Now, the other thing about this that's important to note is that eastern part, that is the wealthy part of the Roman Empire. That is where the money is. And that, by the way, is where Diocletian was. It wasn't in Rome. That's where the action's going on. And so you look at that, modern day Greece, Turkey, you get down into the Levant, which is Palestine, and then down to Egypt where Alexandria is. And so you start going like, okay, these are the important cities that you would look at down there. Well, as I mentioned, Diocletian abdicated to grow cabbages, and so Galerius takes his place. Constantius dies in Great Britain, and the army declares Constantine the emperor. And can you get that from her? So our dogs run around playing with a squeaky toy. And so, the army, and Constantine was so popular that the army just said, hey, we're making you the emperor, and without consulting anybody else. And so a civil war ensues because these other guys go, you can't do that. All right, so let's talk about Galerius a little bit. And he was the emperor that was over in the east. Now he's going to go over and he battles the Persians and some other things like that, but that's unimportant to our story on this. The thing with he was Diocletian's son-in-law. I mentioned that already. The other thing about Galerius is his mother was a pagan priestess, all right? And I mean, she was into it. That was her thing. And so consequently, she's got influence over her son, and he is pagan. He is actually the architect of the Great Persecution, that period of time in there for about 10 years where they just, decimated the Christian population. And so he is the architect of that. And even they say that Diocletian may not have wanted to really do that persecution, but he convinced him to do so. And remember last week we told the story about he's trying to get the entrails and predict the future and some things like that. And that didn't work out. And so they blamed it on the Christians. And so Diocletian says, all right, well, let's get rid of all these guys. So in 305, he replaced Diocletian and declared himself Augustus, which that's one of the titles that they would use. And then he has a fatal and gruesome abdominal illness. And if you read the stories about it, it is not a pleasant thing, whatever he's going through. As I read it, it looked like some kind of stomach cancer or bowel cancer or pancreatic cancer, or something very, very painful in that sense. And so he's dying and he's in pain. And somebody tells him, maybe it's because you've been persecuting Christians. So what does he do? He issues the Edict of Serdica. And I read this thing this last week, the Edict of Serdica. I read the whole document. It's like a one-page letter. And I was tempted to read it tonight, but we don't have the time. But I did have an excerpt of it. But the arrogance and it's just like the temerity of what he said in this edict was just crazy. And so part of it says it says, wherefore for this our indulgent, they, the Christians, ought to pray to their God for our safety, for that of the republic and for that of their own, that the republic may continue uninjured on every side, and that they may be able to live securely in their homes. So I'm dying, and then now he's saying, you Christians, you need to pray to your God for me. All right, now he's not having a conversion experience, but he is definitely saying, I might have got this wrong. All right, and that was in the Edict of Serdica. Now, the Edict of Serdica was basically, it was an edict of toleration for Christianity in that eastern part of the empire, that purple part of the empire that we just looked at. So that's over in, that country in the east. For the rest of the Roman Empire, North Africa and Italy and Gaul and everything like that, it's still going on. All right, and so that was one of the issues that was going on. It was not an empire-wide, and that's why you really don't say that Christianity became legal, because it was still illegal in a good part of the Roman Empire. Now, he dies 5 days later. All right, so the prayers didn't help if anybody prayed for him. So that's Galerius. Now, Constantine the Great. Now, I want you to look at this picture for a few minutes. These are people down here on the bottom left corner. All right, this is a thing of Constantine the Great. Now, as my fellow Nugget fans, you're going to appreciate this. He was born in Serbia. And he's the only child of Constantius and Helena. Now, the reason I laugh at that is because the Denver Nuggets have a player from Serbia that's 7 foot something, giant of a man, and he's the biggest basketball player. When I saw this picture, I said, and he's got a basketball in his hand. Now, that's really not a basketball, that's an orb, but man, they grow basketball players in Serbia. So yeah, that was this. I just thought that was kind of interesting and funny. Now, he, as any emperor does, he does have an ego, all right? And later on, you're going to see that he actually has a column placed for him in Constantinople, and he took the statue of Apollos, had the head topped off, all right, put his own head on top of it. The statue was probably 20 feet tall, and it's on a column that's still there today called the Burnt Column, and some people might be able to go see it. You won't see his statue there because it's gone, but the column is still standing to this day. It's just a crazy, crazy thing about him. Constantius eventually divorced Helena for political reasons. He actually was going to marry, I think he married one of the other emperor's sister or something, and so it was more of a political marriage, but he divorced Helena, all right? And then he was serving the army in Gaul and Britain, Britannia, I think they would have said, and so that's where he's serving in his dad's army up in that area. And so again, in 306, the troops proclaim him emperor. All right, so they're going to do that. They're saying, we'll follow you. You get to be the ruler and everything like that. So he is a dynamic ruler. All right, I don't want to say that. You think about the prototypical, he's got it all going, and people will die on any hill for this guy. This is Constantine. So he builds an army starting up in that area of over 60,000 soldiers, which was a large army. And remember, there's three other armies that are in the Roman Empire. But he's got this army, and so you have to think it's made up of Frenchmen and Germans and Britons, and they're coming. And guess where they're headed? They're headed down to Rome. Now, the other emperors are trying to reach out to him and say, hey, wait a second, what about this and what about that, including his brother or his son-in-law, all right, who's one of the other emperors. Just a hint. And they're saying, what's going on? So he does that. He marches towards Rome. All right. Now, let's talk about his mom just for a second, because I just mentioned her, and I said I have to talk about Helena. All right. And you know Helena. All right. Whether you know her or not, she was huge in fact. Mount St. Helens, that's St. Helen, if you will. That's one of the things. Napoleon was exiled to the Isle of Helena. All right. So I think I got that story right. Anyway, so Constantine loved his mom. So even after dad divorced and he's serving, he still loves his mom. So much so that he makes her Augusta. All right. So now she's in the royal court, in the royal palace. She actually lived in Rome, but he named her an Augusta in 306. So right after he was that. Now, some people will credit her about leading Constantine to Christ, and other people will say, no, Constantine led her to Christ. So you pick your story. I would probably vote for the first one rather than the second one, but who knows? She was of humble origins. She was a stablemate or an innkeeper kind of person in a small little town that we'll look at in a second. And she was advocating, later in her life, she was advocated for working for the poor and the underprivileged and everything like that, because that's where she came from. So she had a heart for that, and influenced her husband in that way as well. Now, about 20 years after this, she went down to a pilgrimage to Palestine, all right, to Jerusalem. It wasn't called Jerusalem. They had to call it some other name because the Romans had outlawed the name of Jerusalem. It was not Jewish at all. And they, in fact, wouldn't let Jews go back there. It was that much. Anyway, so she makes a pilgrimage down there, and she's for a couple of years, and then she finds the burial place of the crucifixion. And in the process of finding the burial place, she finds 3 crosses. And she has this sick woman, and so the sick woman, she comes over and says, I want you to place your hand on this cross. She places a hand on the cross, nothing happens. Goes to the next one, nothing happens. Goes to the third one, she's healed. So now you know it's the true cross. And that's the story that goes on. On that site that she excavated, and by the way, she takes that true cross back to Rome, all right? And they're going to split it up and let it perform miracles for hundreds. And so by the time the Renaissance time, they say there was enough portions of the true cross to build any bridge you wanted to build. All right, so that's how this thing split up. All right, but she's got the true cross. She takes it back or sends it back, And, but that spot is where the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is built. And today it's still there. Now the original one that Constantine built for her, basically it was destroyed by the Muslims back in 11th century. They allowed them to come back in and rebuild that. And that, if you go to Jerusalem, that is the holy site, not the church on the dome, which is where the temple would be and stuff. It's this place. And that is the pilgrimage site for Christians from around the world. She also, in this trip, established the Church of the Nativity and the Church of Elena on the Mount of Olives as well too. So those were 3 churches. Constantine also, I think I may have said this or I haven't, but she's going to die in 330. But that's kind of, so Constantine only outlived her by like 7 years. But significant woman, and she's venerated in worship services even to this day. I experienced that this morning. So let's talk a little bit more about Constantine now. All right. The Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312. Pretty critical date. Now, I'll give $10 if anybody can tell me who this group is. You can't read it. It's hard to read. And it's called Folktopia, all right? And they have an album. It's a heavy metal band or something. I'd listened to a couple of their songs. I said, And it's called The Battle of the Milvian Bridge. And so I took a screenshot of their album cover and was able to paste it on here. So, that's for them. So you see the bridge in the background. But I want you to notice in particular this guy's shield, all right? Because that becomes very, very important. And we'll talk a little about that. So Constantine, before the battle, has a vision. And this is the way the story goes later on, that he has a vision. And in this vision, the sun is shining, or a bright light is shining to him, and it says, in this sign, conquer. And the sign was the Chi Rho, all right? And that's what you'll see. And that's what's on this guy's shield down here. And so Chi Rho is the word, the first 2 letters in Greek of Christ, so of Christus, all right? And so that's what they put on there. So if you ever see the symbol, that's the symbol that they would use for Christ, and in particular, a military symbol. So Constantine had all of his soldiers, his army, paint that on their shields before they go into battle. Now, you go into battle, people are superstitious about things. And so they have superstitions and they're praying to whatever gods, and they see these shields and they go, who is that? Because they know it's for somebody. And that's when they say, this is the God, this is Christ, the God that was resurrected. And it really puts the fear in them. And half of any battle, football game, whatever, is played between the 9 inches in your head, right? It's in the brain. And so this is a thing like that. And so they won the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. It was a bloody battle, but they still won it. He takes Rome. He actually sacks Rome, so don't believe that the first time it was sacked was in 437. He sacks Rome, and his soldiers go in and take things, and basically now he's the new emperor over Rome. So that's it. And he's on the path to becoming a believer, though, because of this vision. And if you believe that story. All right. So I kind of like the story, but I wasn't there, so I can't tell you it was true or not true. All right. Now, so after that, he had, he knew that Galerius had good press on the Edict of Serdica, because that was kind of popular. And plus now he's got Christ on his cross, on his shield. So he says it's time. So he and another emperor get together and they issue the Edict of Milan. All right, and that's in 313. Now, it's the end of persecution. This is officially the end of persecution, and it's an edict of tolerance. It gives religious liberty for everyone. It wasn't just for Christians, by the way. It mentions Christians specifically, but it says the government has no business in persecuting people or trying to outlaw any kind of religion. All right, that's been to this day most places now, not every place, but that was in particular that. And then the other thing that was significant, that it's restored property that was taken from Christians. And so Constantine, basically in the edict, he says, if this church property or this individual's property was taken as a Christian, it's going to be given back by the empire. And they're going to restore them. And by the way, if we know that Mark over here was the one that took it, Mark, you're paying it back. All right. And so that's it. And so Constantine's got the pointy end of the sword, and he'll say, "You agree, Mark?" And Mark goes, "I do agree with that." Whatever it may have been. All right. And so that was it. But that was, think if you were a Christian and all of a sudden you got sign of great wealth coming towards you, it's going to impact things. It was a legal precedent for tolerance. I've mentioned that already. And it sets the stage for a dramatic ascendancy of Christianity. Christianity is interesting because if it's in times of persecution, it grows. In times of peace and prosperity, it can grow as well, especially. And it grows different. You know, it's like, what are you focusing on? And you're going to see now a time of peace and prosperity for the empire and for Christians. And it will, all sorts of things are going to happen over the next, what are we, 2025, so the next 1,700 years. All right, so that's it. And then it established a precedent. Now this is an interesting thing. This lesson is called the marriage of church and state. This established a precedent for church and state relations. All right, that's going to change and develop over time as well too, not always in good ways. All right, the lasting impact, and I'm going to have several of these. And the lasting impact is that Christianity is legal. Can I get a celebration? Oh, all right, thank you. I was talking with Brian a few weeks ago, and he says, "Yeah, I wasn't too sure that, you know, Constantine and the church becoming legal and all that stuff was a good thing." I said, "If you were a persecuted Christian, you probably were." And he said, "Well, I guess that's right." So there you go. So Christianity is legal. Let's have a party. And all right. Now we're going to talk about Constantinople. Constantine goes back to his home state. And I blew this part of the map up. That was the one that had the pink and everything, so you can ignore those colors because now Constantine is it. On this map, you can see Rome way over here. The yellow star right in the middle is it's Serbia today, and that's about where he was born. All right? And so he's going back to his home, sort of. We'll talk about that. And then you can see the Aegean Sea was going to be between Rome and Greece. Over out there, you see the Black Sea, no relationship to me. And then down here is the Sea of Marmara, which was a whole different thing. And that's Asia. So that's where Europe and Asia, the pink up here, that Moesia, Thracia, that is Europe. Right of that is Asia. That is a little place called Byzantium. All right? And Constantine says, "I know a place that we can build a new Rome." All right? So let's get cracking on that. And so let's go there, Byzantium. All right. So now, location. Why go there? Lots of things. First of all, the military security of this place is going to stand for about 1,100 years. We're in barely over 200 years as a country, 250 years, I guess, something like that. All right. This is going to stand for about until the 15th century, until this finally falls, and this little place he's going to build, and some people are going to go there next year. So it's on trade routes, and this is the red is the Silk Road. You've heard? I'm sorry. The blue is what they call the Silk Road. It goes to China and India. The red up there is the Orient Express. All right, and so those are the trade routes, and basically that connects Asia with all the European stuff over here, and so that's kind of right in the middle. You pass through that. And it's the yellow dot up there, basically, if you go onto that map. It's got a great place for a naval base called the Golden Horn, and we'll show you a couple things on that. It's in commerce routes, and it's near Mom's old place. All right. Whoop. All right, we'll move on. What else would the other one say? It's not a fixer-up. It's not Rome. Rome is kind of getting long in the tooth now. I mean, Nero had the remodel project in the 1st century. It's a couple of centuries older now. There's all sorts of things going on. And, you know, anytime you get a big metropolis like that, you know, it's got problems. And so it's kind of like, let's go to a new place. So it's going to start off on this basically spit of land. And this isn't the land that it's on, but this represents it. It's got the Golden Horn on the north side, and that is a place basically this is a peninsula that sticks out into the sea. It's not even an isthmus, but it gets real close to being an isthmus between Europe and Asia. And literally, if you go there, you can stand there, and it's less than a mile from coast to coast. You can see over that real easily. It's not as big as this lake out here, just to our west. You can easily see through this thing. And there's only about 15,000 people. On this thing, there's nobody there, right? So there's only about 15,000 people here. So it's ready to do this. And let's go ahead and do this thing. So now, within about, I'm going to say 60 years, it's going to look something more like this. All right. And now up here on the top of this thing is the Golden Horn. Down below is it's called the Bosphorus Strait, and it's a real tricky way to navigate through there. The Golden Horn, you can see back, you can put all sorts of naval stuff up in there that's going to impact. And then on the south, so it kind of sticks out on here. It's got a great view to the east, you can build your palace down here, and everything goes like that. This hippodrome that's in the middle of it, the hippodrome structures are not there any longer, but the pathway or the footprint of it is still there, and they use that basically to go through a big part of the heart of the city. It would hold around 80,000 people when they would have their games. So that gives you an idea of the scope of that, the size of that thing. So it's huge. I mean, that's the size of most of our football stadiums here, and this was a little bit longer and probably not as tall, and they would have games, and there was all sorts of story about the Byzantine or the Roman games that would go on there, and parades and everything else. There were some bloody, bloody things that happened there too. We're not going to get into all that today. Back over here it was the court of Constantinople. That's not the palace, but it was a different place that they would have events there as well. And it's hard to tell, but back up, north of the stadium, and for the people here, I'll point it out, but it's back up here is the Hagia Sophia. And the Hagia Sophia is a church, and it means holy wisdom. And the Hagia Sophia still stands today. It was really built, but Constantine established it, but it was really rebuilt by Emperor Theodosius in about 200 years after that, still standing today. Beautiful building. It was the crown prince of buildings in the European, Asian world. You'd have to go to the Taj Mahal or someplace in China or someplace to find anything close to it. Some interesting things about Constantinople as well is, how are you going to get all people to move up there? Well, put the government there and that'll help. But he actually said anybody living inside of its city walls, no taxes. Now, how many people are going to move just to avoid paying taxes? A lot. It's like now you move inside the city walls and they soak you, right? It's kind of the other way around. Let's see what else to say that. It was the wealthiest city in Europe from the 4th century to the 13th century. Okay, all of Europe, this city had more money. There was more money there than any other place for 900 years. All right, and so you just look at that thing and you go like, kind of worked out all right. It came to be known, and we're going back to the future now, it came to be known with titles such as the Queen of Cities. It was the megalopolis by the great city, all right? It was in colloquial speech, all right? It was just called the city. And today it's called Istanbul. Istanbul means to the city. So just like you would call New York City the city, this was the city. All right, and that's what Istanbul is. That's the common language. And so they said Constantinople. Anyway, I won't get into all that. In the language of other people, I thought this was interesting. It was referred to just as reverently. Medieval Vikings came down, and there's a whole thing about Bulgarians and stuff, and they used to call it Miklagora. I'm probably not saying that right, which means big city. In Arabic, the city was sometimes called the great city of the Romans, and in Persia, it was called the throne of the Romans. Worldwide renowned people would come to this city, and lots of things would kind of, they would go away awed, and they would go away in fear of the Romans, all right, because they're like, we're a bunch of hicks. How can we go to battle with somebody that's got, and the wealth and everything else, I mean, it's all on display there. And if you get a chance, go to Istanbul and go see it, because there's still so much there that's still around. All right, so that's there. The lasting impacts of this, and there is another one. So first one was that. The empire is not based in Rome, Italy. Now that is significant, and that's going to have significant results in a few hundred years after this. All right, and I could give it away now, but I won't, because it's a longer story and we're going to run out of time. All right, let's talk about Constantine and the church just a little bit. All right, he was a big-time patron of the church, as I've already mentioned. He built the original St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. It's not the one standing today, but that he was the first one to put St. Peter's Basilica on the map. All right, just to let you know. He built the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, as we mentioned, and he called, and this was a big thing, the Council of Nicaea, and that's where we're going to spend some time there. All right, so Constantine was a major player. I hope you see that's going on. So the lasting impact that he has is when he calls this, what's significant about that is who's calling the council? The Roman emperor is calling the council of bishops. Now that sets a precedent. Not necessarily good, but that's it. But this is that official relationship now between church and state. I can mess in your business. You might or might not be able to mess in mine. But that's what he's doing. So the Council of Nicaea, you say, where's Nicaea? And if I gave you all a map and I said, point it out without putting labels on it, it might be a hard time to do. But you got to think about his home territory. All right. Now this map gives it away. It's down here in the bottom right corner of this. And here is Constantinople, kind of up in the center. And here's another place called Helenopolis, named after Helen. That's right. And there's another town over here on the end of that little, whatever you call it, inlet there, called Nicomedia, which is going to kind of come into play a little bit, just to keep that in the back of your mind. Nicaea is a lake. Let's see, do I get all this stuff on here? Yeah. It is about 75 miles as a crow flies from Constantinople, which, by the way, at this time was still under construction. I mean, they didn't start construction on that, and it took years to build some of the things that they're going to build there, because they're building palaces and that hippodrome, and you know, it's just going to go on there. So that's it. It's a lake resort town, so it's kind of up in the hills, beautiful. You know, let's get away. It's that kind of place, and it's a temporary home for Constantine. So why did you hold the council in Nicaea? I'm there already. You guys come see me, right? That's one of the things that's going to go on. And this is his home territory. Right? He's playing on his home court. So a little bit of the background about the Council of Nicaea, and I wanted to get in. We're going to spend most of our time right here. All right, good. The reason that Constantine called this is he is just coming out of this civil war on the empire, all right? And he's looking for unity. He's looking for not to have disagreements and everything like that. But now you're in a time of peace, and basically from the Edict of Milan until here is just a few years, all right? It's not that many years. And already the church people are fighting, all right? And so there are disagreements going on. You know, that never happens in churches, does it? All right, you have church people fighting, and you got to remember, these are places, most of the Christians were in large cities, Antioch, Alexandria, Rome, Ephesus. Those are the big time cities, and that's what's going on. And so you have different thinking. Athens was another large number of Christians in Athens as well too. And then, I forget Jerusalem, right? There's actually a church reestablished in Jerusalem, and that's a significant site for them. And so you have these bishops from all over the country, all over the empire that are fighting about things. All right. Say, what? I love this picture because it's looking around like, you guys are fighting, right? So anyway, so the leadership, what are they fighting about? What are the disagreements? They're not really fighting yet. There's disagreements, and it's over leadership and church governance because they're doing different things in different places. All right. And so how do you determine, like Corinth, how do you determine who is the bishops in Corinth? All right. And does the bishop in Corinth, because most of the time it's going to be singular. All right. You're going to have bishops, but there's going to be like a lead pastor, if you will. And so they will call them the bishop. All right. And so that would be the way you look at it. And so you have that in there. It's just like our church. We have 3 elders. One of them is a pastor. All right. And so Ben would be, in that sense, the bishop. All right. So that's the way they just started calling him that way. And that's just kind of the way it went. All right. Well, what happens if one guy decides, this is a little podunk town. I want to go over to the big city and be the bishop. How do you replace bishops? Who decides those kind of things? And by the way, make sure they're teaching the right things. And so you start to see those issues that are going on. And so they're having disagreements on that because we think it ought to be one way and somebody else thinks it should be another. And that can still cause issues today. When you talk about how do leaders get in place, it's huge. All right. How to treat the lapsy. Now, the lapsy were all these people that coming out of the great persecution, and the lapsy were the ones that denied Christ. They gave it up, and now they want to be back as Christians. All right. And how do you treat them? How do you treat them if they were a bishop versus common Joe? A little bit different situations. So they, if you go down to Carthage in North Africa, they're like, no way. In fact, if those guys come back and darken our door, just take the swords out and kill them all. Because that's the way they were going to treat them down there. It was like, you're not back in. All right. Go to some other place, there's some things that they would do that would be correct. But I would talk about that. Because I look at it and I say, let's admit it. Peter denied Christ 3 times. All right. How did the Lord let him back in? Well, so it's not that it's unheard of. And he's, apostle. So, all right. Another issue is the dating of Easter. All right. And why this is an issue and everything, I don't know, but it was. And there were disagreements. I don't want to say fights. There were disagreements over how you dated Easter. And the way it was dated was basically based off of the Jews, and what the Jews determined was Passover, and it was 2 weeks after Passover, blah, 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 blah. Wears me out to think about those kind of things, but other people said that's not the way you should do it. And by the way, we don't need to rely on those Jews anyway. That was an attitude. All right. And then there was this Arian controversy that we are going to dig into if we have enough time. I'm going to run a little over tonight if that's okay with you guys, because we started late too. All right. All right. Let's talk about his goal was unity. And so here's the agenda. Deal with the Arian controversy. When is Easter? We're just running through these. They're going to develop canons for polity, which is church politics. So governance, there's going to be canons, and we talked about canons. So they're going to have something you can measure against. This is the standard for how you do all these things. All right. They're going to have canons for the clergy. There are going to be rules that are made about, for instance, celibacy. Is when you see this come into place for bishops, and what does that mean, and what does that look like? And it was really weird, by the way. And then there's going to be canons about lapsy, and then there's going to be future actions, which basically are going to be, we're going to exile the heretics. There were 20 of these canons listed, by the way, and that dealt with all this stuff. And anyway, I won't want to get into that. So some of the major players. Well, remember who he is. Keep him front and center, because he is on a pedestal. He is the one that called this meeting, this council. He's the one that's paying for this, by the way. He's paying for all these people to come. And he was really not a participant other than he's going to hold them there until they fix these things. All right. So, and if there was actually a council that happened before then that he called, and only like 8 people showed up. And he, by the way, says, I don't really care what you guys do, but you're going to work it out. All right. That's basically what his role was in this. And and then he's going to be the enforcer at the end. So pretty important dude. Arius, all right, he's the king of the heretics, is what he would later be called. And then there's another guy called Eusebius of Nicomedia, and that was that little town I put out. This guy's a bishop. And by the way, all three of these guys, well, these two guys are Arian for sure, all right? Constantine most likely was leaned in the Arian way, and we'll talk about what that means in a little bit. But he probably had leanings that way, but he's a secular guy. He's like, this is a church business, but just figure it out, all right? But do figure something out. All right, and then over on this side, there's a little guy named Athanasius. And he was called, and this guy, so I've told several people, I was at the pharmacy this last week, and my pharmacist's last name is Athanasius. And I said, you know who that is? He says, of course I do. And it turns out he is a deacon in the local Coptic church, and Kathy and I went there today. I got tons of stuff to talk about that, and I'm still processing some of the things that went on there. But Athanasius, he was not a bishop. He was a priest. All right. But he's accompanying Alexander, who's the bishop of Alexandria. So you got a cool name, Alexander of Alexandria. All right. So that's it. And Athanasius, though, he is vocal in this thing. He is a pugnacious fighter. All right. And he is the one that basically is going to develop or advocate for the Trinitarian position opposed to Arian position. And a lot of people will look at him later and say he is the one that saved Trinitarian theology. Otherwise, we'd all be Arian theology. All right? So Eusebius down here, just to let you know who he is, Eusebius is, I'm going to use, I'm trying to find the right word, but he's a player. He is a political guy. He's somehow related to Constantine, all right? You don't really ever figure out what it was, but he's related to Constantine. But he is a political player, and he's going to come into play later on after this council and stuff like that. But he is the one advocating for Arianism. Arian as well, too. Arian was a very eloquent speaker, dynamic, persuasive, all the things like that they can get people to follow. And so that's some of the players like this. Athanasius too, by the way, he is also known as the Black Dwarf. So he was a dark-skinned, short guy too. And so for some reason, I kept thinking of Danny DeVito and type of person, just a little bit, just getting, or the Sicilian in The Princess Bride or something, just somebody on that line is kind of the character that I would vision Athanasius being. All right, so we're going to talk about the Arian part of this thing. I want to give you some cautions on theology, all right? And hopefully you'll hear this in the sense that it's given. One is you're incapable of understanding God, and you have to admit that. All right, and I use an illustration that many people have heard. I want you to explain electricity to my dog. You might be able to do it, but my dog's not going to understand. All right, and so you can kind of go through that. We are not capable of understanding God. We are not God. All right, and so it is beyond that. So that's a caution. The next caution is you cannot describe the indescribable. All right? When people try to describe God, you fall short. You cannot describe the indescribable. All right? And so that is a caution. The Council of Nicaea is going to try to describe the indescribable, by the way. You're going to see that. I think that's one of the things that they have a flaw in. Next thing is you can be tempted to make God in your image rather than you being in the image of God. All right, and so that's the thing is you can only describe and understand what you're capable of doing it, which means that you only have your basis of experience, which means God's not going to be bigger than that. All right, it's in essence, you've got your own box. You're going to put God in that box somehow. And that is a danger of that. You can be tempted to make God into your image. And then if that's true, you can be tempted to find ways to manipulate God through legalism, through appeasement, or through coercion. And people have tried that throughout the ages. People still do. God, I'll be your servant forever if you let me pass this test today. I mean, that's a silly thing, but that's the way people, they'll make these things like that because they were trying to find ways to do that. God doesn't operate that way. All right. God's not going to help you in the football game and blah, 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 whatever it is. All right. You may get confused and have a crisis of faith. When you start dealing in these topics, and I think we're going to hit more of these topics later on, but you start dealing with this kind of thing, you may look at it and go like, it is so confusing. I don't understand it and I don't want to understand it. I would tell you that there is a mystery of God that I do not understand, and I love that. All right. So if you don't do that, and you say, no, I've got to know all the facts, be very careful, because if you won't, and you're going to have a crisis of faith. All right. And then the last one is you may be fooled by Satan. Consider Eve when she was tempted. She was told that what? You can't eat. Yeah, there's this fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. And if you eat that, you'll be like God. And some people want to get into this zoology stuff. And so those are my cautions about that. And there's probably others that people can add to it. All right. And then I'm supported by this, by the way, by Augustine of Hippo, who's fast becoming one of my favorite guys in history. All right. He said, he who denies the Trinity is in danger of losing his salvation. All right. He who tries to understand the Trinity is in danger of losing his mind. And I thought, man, does that not just say it instead of all my cautions and everything else? All right. So it all begins with a question. And this guy's asking this question. This young man says, well, I got one small question. Jesus is a son of God, right? But he's also God. I'm just a little confused by that whole thing. All right. And that's where it can get confusing, because there's different terminologies that are used throughout the Bible and how we talk too. All right. So let's talk about the Arian core beliefs. Now, this picture, by the way, I found this one. I thought there is a story that during the debate at the Council of Nicaea, Arius was up talking about whatever he's doing and preaching and giving this golden tongue oratory about Arianism, all right, about what he believes. And this German bishop named Nicholas, Saint Nicholas later on, comes down and does the slap, kind of like the Will Smith against Kevin Hart Academy Award slap. And he wants to slap the words out of him. And that actually, I don't know, wasn't there, but that's what they report is that actually happened. And so get a picture of Santa Claus going down and just slapping the snot out of Arius. So I just thought that was great. Anyway, so the Arian core beliefs. The Father and the Son were not co-eternal, all right? There was, and they'll use the term, there was a time when Jesus was not, when he was not, okay? And the other thing is the Son was divine, but was created by the Father. Thus, the Son is inferior to the Father, created out of nothing, so not the same substance of the Father. The Son was made, not begotten. All right? Does that sound like any verses that you might hear in Scripture? You know, when Jesus talks about himself as the Son of God, well, if you're going to, and this is Aristotle thinking, if you're going to be the Son, that means that you were born. That means that you were fathered by God. And so they get that, and he calls him Father. And so you can start to see that thinking like that, and that's it. But then it goes into, well, wait a second, is he God? Or is he just inferior to God? And that's the key thing. The other is I yelled this word substance out there, and there's a Greek word called homoousios, and you know, I don't want you to have to remember that. It means, and I'll just use this term, I heard another guy say it, the same God stuff as the Father. All right, so they're referring to God stuff, the substance. We look at things and we have a substance, all right, and we think about that. And he's saying basically they're the same things. And you'll hear people just try to describe the Trinity, and they'll talk about a tree, and a tree is roots and leaves and branches and the bole of the tree and everything else like that. Those are all the same stuff, all right? That's not God. You cannot describe God in that sense, all right? Just to try to say that God is made out of substances or has a substance is kind of weird. All right. That was the teachings of Arius, by the way, just in a nutshell. Don't want you to get too much further into that. The Council of Nicaea, the outcomes. They had the 20 canons that did all this stuff. One of the things that we talk about the bishops is they recognized metropolitan bishops, all right? And they called them patriarchs. These were the bishops that were basically over many churches, especially you got these churches now in these big cities, and you got them all over the place, and you got to say, we need a leader of that whole church that's going to represent that whole church. And so that you start to see what's developing on this thing is a little bit of a hierarchy in the church, if you will. And so they look at that, they call them patriarchs. A lot of churches still call them patriarchs. They fixed to Easter, and then the other big thing that they came up with was the Nicene Creed. You've heard of the Nicene Creed. You maybe have repeated a version of the Nicene Creed. Rich Mullins sang a song called I Believe, called Creed, which is real interesting. And I wanted to cover it a little bit. All right. So this is the original Nicene Creed. And this is written in English, obviously, because they did, with the help of translation. It says, and so this is it. Now, you're not going to read that. It says, we believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and of all things visible and invisible, and in one Lord Jesus Christ, the Son of God, the only begotten, begotten of the Father before all ages. Do you hear what they're addressing in this? Think about what Arian teachings was and listen to the wording in this. And I'll tell you that this was wordsmithed and there was emphasis on certain things. All right, continuing on. Light of light, true God of true God, begotten, not made, of one essence with the Father. That's that same word. All right, the substance with the Father, by whom all things were made. For us, men, and for our salvation, it came down from heaven. It was incarnate of the Holy Spirit and the Virgin Mary and became man. He was crucified for us under Pontius Pilate and suffered and was buried. Did I get this one? Yeah, here we go. And on the third day he rose again, according to the Scriptures, and ascended into heaven and sits at the right hand of the Father. And he shall come again with glory to judge the living and the dead, whose kingdom shall have no end, and in the Holy Spirit. And then listen to this, part of the creed. But as for those who say there was when he was not, and before being born he was not, and that he came into existence out of nothing, or who assert that the Son of God is from a different hypostasis or substance, or is created, or is subject to alteration or change, these the Catholic Church anathematizes. All right. Now, you probably didn't say that in the Creed if you've ever said that last Peter, because they changed this thing up. All right. And even they'll call it the Nicene Creed, and it'll be something else. And that would be hard to make into a song too, right, Jess? So that's it. Later on, they're going to do a second ecumenical council that's going to happen about 381, I think, something like that. All right. So the lasting impacts of this creed, the authority of this, we already talked about the authority of a church council over local churches. That's canons laid out now. And then they began that hierarchical church structure, and they established orthodoxy. Orthodoxy is similar to a canon in the fact that you got a straight rule, but that comes into the correct way of believing. 98% of Christians today adhere to the Nicene Creed. The two groups that don't are Jehovah's Witnesses and the Latin Mormons, Latter-day Saints. Those two don't do it. I actually listened to a podcast by LDS about the Nicene Creed, and he kind of had to dance around what that meant, but they believe in Arianism. All right, so it's still around today. All right, so that is a lasting impact of this council. All right, it also set up the impact of you're going to have more councils in the future. All right. Church reorganization. This is a very busy screen. All right. And I looked at this and I said, how can I do this thing right? I'm just going to go through the purple part of it. The church is really starting to meet in church buildings. They're building church buildings. They're doing this kind of thing. You have metropolitan patriarchs now, and you have priests, which is a Latin name. Before this was all bishops. It basically means that they're a bishop. A priest and a bishop would have been the same thing, but Latin is a rising language. There's more and more people speaking that over in the West, and so they call them priests over there. The agape meal is pretty much gone by the wayside then. If you go back over here, they have the early canon of the New Testament that they're starting to look at. It's not, we're going to talk more about that next week. They're less reading writings of church leaders, all right? Less of that. And then the last thing down there that you're going to see is creeds. Kathy and I went today to the Coptic church, which would be, I don't want to get into that. I bet you there were a dozen creeds that they read today, all right, that they recited, and people are saying them right along with them, including the Nicene Creed, a version of it. So becomes a big deal, because the thing with the creed is it's easy. And you'll hear that in churches. We'll say, everybody stand up and let's say the creed. You know, I believe in God the Father, Almighty Maker of heaven and earth. We'll say, and I do believe that. All right. So that's that part of it. So lessons for us, and Ben and Nate and I were talking Friday morning, and Ben said last week we talked about some of this. I said, you just wrote my conclusion. There are lessons that we recognize that we do and will have differences in what we believe and how we worship. That's going to happen. So recognizing that, think about how we work together as a body of believers when we have differences, because that is important. And then I added this. I said, we can learn from history what mistakes were made and what worked and what didn't work, and hopefully not do the same stupid things that didn't work, because a lot of them didn't. All right. Questions or comments? And for a second, I don't hear anybody. All right. So if they're online, we'll catch you next week on that. Next week, the church is going to start growing up. All right. And we're going to cover, and we actually have two parts on this, and we're going to cover the same time period. And there is a plethora of topics that we can talk about. All right. And as I go through that, I am going to cover a brief history of the Bible, and the New Testament in particular, and not just the Bible. I'm going to really cover the New Testament. I'm going to talk about Christian ascetics and monks and the establishment of monasteries, and we're going to get into some of that. Historically, the fall of Rome happens in this period. I do want to talk about that and kind of some of the impacts that happen from that, and maybe introduce some heavyweight theology, all right? Because believe me, the Nicene Creed didn't answer all the questions for all time, all right? People came up, oh yeah, but, and you're going to have more of that. I'd love to cover Augustine of Hippo in some times and some of the things that he did. And, you know, now I'm talking about this session next week and the one after that, or maybe something else that you want me to cover. And I would just encourage you, say, why don't you tell or ask a question, what about, you know, where the Pope came from? I don't know what you want to say. And I could, you know, I'd say he's from Chicago. It's Pope Bob, right? So I'd say that tongue in cheek, but anyway, I just want to leave that open. And as I prepare for the next couple of weeks, I'm really looking forward to it. And with that, we are done for the night. Thanks.
Thank you, Ken.
How do we stop, Jess?